In this video, I'll be covering how highlighters work in the Ultimate Socket system. Highlighters are used as a way to let the users know that an item is close to the socket. Highlighters are optional, so you don't need to use them if they don't suit your use case. The socket uses a collider to detect if an item is within the highlighting range. By default, the socket sets the highlight detection collider to match the main detection collider. Therefore, if you're within placeable range, the socket will also highlight. However, there may be a use case where you actually want the socket to use its own collider to detect if the socket should highlight. This allows you to set a specific range for the placeable area and a specific range for the highlight area. If you require this, you can untick the checkbox and manually configure the highlighter collider. For this guide, we'll be keeping the highlighter zone the same as the placeable area by keeping this ticked. Let's take a look at the UI panels. This format is similar across all of the Ultimate Socket system. The list section offers you the ability to bolt on any number of the highlighter components just by pressing the Add button. They are just as easy to remove. However, the best bit about this system is that it's designed for you to add to it. If you create your own highlighter component, which we'll get to later, it will automatically show up in this list, allowing you to easily manage all highlighting functionality in a single place. As you can see, the socket system comes with a couple of built-in highlighters. These can be used for generic use cases. Let's take a look at them now. The Socket Color Controller. This highlighter will modify the color of a sprite when an item is within placeable range. However, just because an item is within placeable range doesn't mean that the item is actually placeable. For example, you may have a weapon socket that accepts sword items, but not if they're damaged. So because of this, you can assign a specific color for when the item is placeable and for when it's not placeable. You can also configure how quickly the sprite changes color. The Socket Sprite Scaler. This highlighter component is similar to the color controller, apart from it modifies the scale of a sprite when an item is within placeable range. A powerful feature of this system is that you can enable multiple highlighters at the same time, allowing you to easily combine effects to achieve a more interesting highlight. For example, the Sprite Scaler and Sprite Color Controller work well together. The last of the built-in highlighters is the Socket Hologram. Out of the box, this component just works. With the default settings, it will dynamically create a clone of the item that's within placeable range and show a hologram version of it. You can of course change the hologram materials if you wish. If you need to display a specific object instead of one that's dynamically generated, you can choose a different option from the drop-down. Single Prefab allows you to define a specific prefab to display. Game Object. Game Object allows you to set a specific game object to display. And finally, Item Specific allows you to define a different object to display for each different item type. To use this, just create a hologram prefab settings object and assign the prefab you'd like to see displayed for each item type. Okay, so that's a quick overview on the built-in highlighters. Let me show you how you can create your own bespoke highlighter. For this guide, we'll create a highlighter that turns on a torch when the item is within placeable range. This example assumes you already have a socket set up with some items you can place. If you haven't, you can check out the item placement guide to help you get set up. I'll create a new script for the highlighter and open my code editor. Let's start by adding a reference to our torch light. Okay, great. Now we're ready to make this component a socket highlighter. The first thing you need to do is implement the iSocket highlighter interface. As you can see, I now have 3 functions that I need to implement. The setup function is useful if you need to store a reference to the socket highlighter, because through this component you can access the main socket component and therefore access anything to do with the socket. However, for this simple example, we won't need this right now. The start highlight function is called when an item enters the highlight area. So, for our torch example, let's enable the light. In a similar fashion, when an item leaves the highlight area, the stop highlight function is called. So here we'll just disable the light. Let's take a look at this in the editor. So, as we return to the editor, you can see our highlighter is now showing in our list of highlighters. Let's add the highlighter and assign a torch reference. Now it's time to test this works. Okay, great, this is working perfectly. Now, I'll show you how you could upgrade this highlighter to change the color of the light based on if the item is actually placeable or not. Remember, just because an item is within placeable range doesn't mean that the item is allowed to be placed. Because of this, we can change the color of the lights to reflect the placeable state. Let's go back to the code and make those changes. First, let's create two color variables. We'll have one for when the item is placeable and another for when it's not placeable. Next, let's cache a reference to the socket highlighter. We'll need this for accessing the socket. It's important to know that this needs to be a serialized field. This is because the reference is set when the component is added to the socket, which is outside of play mode. So by making it a serialized field, it will persist the reference. Next, we're going to create a coroutine that is going to check if the item is placeable and update the torch light based on the outcome. Now, this next part is a little complicated, but I'll do my best to explain. You can check if an item is placeable by calling the canPlace function on the socket and pass in the item you want to check is placeable. However, you may want to ignore some specific placement criteria. Most of the time, you'll be using the not holding item placement criteria. This criteria means that the item doesn't get socketed when the item is within placeable range. It does this so you can confirm you want to place the item by letting go of it. This is fairly standard practice for most VR games. This does mean that if you're holding the item near the socket and the highlighter was to show, it would always show as unplaceable, as the item is technically not allowed to be placed because you're still holding onto the item. Therefore, the not holding item placement criteria has not been met. This does mean that if you're holding the item near the socket and the highlighter was to show, it would always show as unplaceable, as the item is technically not allowed to be placed because you're still holding onto the item. Therefore, the not holding item placement criteria has not been met. So, to avoid this, you can specify specific placement criteria to ignore when checking if the item is placeable. Going back to our example, we'll tell the canPlace function that we want to ignore the not holding placement criteria. Remember, there are two criteria, one for the socket and one for the placeable item, so we need to ignore both. Now we'll update the torch color based on if the item is placeable. Let's check out the updated torch highlighter. Now, on the torch highlighter, the reference to the socket highlighter hasn't been set. This is because the setup function is called when the component is added to the socket, which we did before adding the code to cache the reference. We can either drag in a reference, the socket highlighter is nested below the socket game object, or we can simply remove the component and re-add it. But we'll have to assign the torch reference again in this case. Now, let's check out the new highlighter. Fantastic, that's working really well. Now, let's quickly add some demo criteria to the sword to make it unplaceable. We should now see a blue light showing instead of the green light. Okay, perfect. The highlighter now updates the color of the light based on if the item is placeable or not. And on that note, that wraps up the highlighter functionality guide. If you have any questions, please get in touch via the support email or drop a message in the Discord. Thank you for watching.